So, it's just me right now. Professor Morrison is in class. I'm his assistant, Nicole. Today we're going to be reading a story called Xeron. It was written by Makino Shin'ichi. Xeron was originally written in 1931, and the version we're looking at right now was translated by Mathew Fargo in his PhD dissertation called Modern Japanese Literature as a Joke. So, let's get started. Xeron by Makino Shin'ichi. Moreover, in order to properly embark upon this primitive new lifestyle, I was faced with the task of hawking all my new tracts and treatises, my home furnishings, and all other remaining possessions, only to be left perplexed over what to do with one unpawnable bronze bust. Surely my readers are familiar with the life sans bras likeness entitled Bust of Makino, which stood alongside the likes of chicken, cow, owl, and other wooden sculptures by artist Takekawa Makio in the fall exhibition at Nippon Art Institute 2 years ago. Having considering every possible method for jettisoning the statue, I concluded that I had no other option but to transport it to one Monsieur Fujiya of Whirlwind Village for safekeeping. For some time now, Monsieur Fujiya had been longing to throw a celebration in honor of Tatekawa's achievement in Bust of Makino, but my vagrant lifestyle had obliged the statue to move about at my discretion until the opportunity presented itself, which it suddenly had. I bundled the bust into a particularly large and durable rucksack, swung a sturdy walking staff before me, hung a buck knife from my shoulder, and set out upon my journey. The new life that awaited me was all but burnt upon my inner eyelids, and I was thus desirous to be done with this discretion as quickly as possible. Riding an express train from Shinjuku, dressed as I was in my poor excuse for mountaineering gear, I debarked 4 stops later at Kashiwa Station and, without so much as stopping to breathe the country air, made an immediate beeline north, back uphill for a couple of miles to Tsukada Village, where I intended to borrow a cart horse named Xeron from a friend at the village watermill. Even with its shortcuts, my itinerary was precocious enough that in order to conceivably reach my destination before nightfall, I would have to rely upon the courage of my good friend Xeron to guide me through its challenges. Now, were you exit the same station anywhere along the structural tracks, or at Odawara Station at the Atami line, and turn your eyes up to the northwestern sky, you would doubtlessly espy one lonely peak, rearing its heavy head up like a fat Buddha right before where the Hakone Mountains and the Ashikaga Mountains are divided by the Doryo Forest and the foothills of Myojingatake Mountain. Situated some 40 kilometers from the sea and rising a good 900 meters above its waves, the protrusion is called Tourette Peak, parts of which have become an object of inquiry to a certain group of geologists and archaeologists due to the fossilized scallop shells located there. A mountain which is furthermore feared by locals as the home of the wolves and foxes and sometimes boars that come out during harvest season to torment the villagers situated around its foothills, making it a sort of block-in the eyes of adventurous hunters. Monsieur Fujiya Hachiro, my beloved mentor and perhaps the world's most obscurely located scholar of classical Greek and medieval European chivalrous literature, lived there in a home that he called Pierre Vent. On the grounds of this villa, hidden deep within a forest gorge, there stood at intervals a number of decidedly rudimentary log cabins, each named things like the Gym of Charlemagne, the Library of La Mancha, the Atelier of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the Shield of Idea. It was these rooms that he would lend out to those poorest of his friends, who were pursuing the way of the arts. A troubadour author, I myself had spent some time as a guest in the Shield of Idea, where I underwent Monsieur Fujiya's Stoic pedagogy. The sculptor Tatekawa, in fact, was a guest himself in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood cabin at this time, and it was here that he spent some 2 years making this very bust with me as a model. When I was chosen as the model for Tatekawa's piece, the local villagers began their vituperious defense of the impoverished Tatekawa, sympathizing within the taciturn artist, asking why he hadn't chosen a horse or a cow or something that in vain as his theme. This was mainly because, had Tatekawa chosen a theme of this ilk, he would receive numerous and immediate inquiries from parties wishing to purchase said horse or cow. Had he insisted on sculpting a human form, why couldn't he have chosen the village mayor or the local landlord as a model? Had he chosen the mayor, village money could have been allocated for a commemorative statue. Had he chosen the landlord, this man would doubtlessly have spared no expense in erecting a statue monumentalizing his virtue for future generations of villagers, and had secretly expressed his desire to do so. Or had he chosen a local hero like Sakata no Kintoki or Ninomiya Kinjiro, then surely the piece could have been sponsored by an area school or shrine. But still, nevertheless, regardless, Tatekawa decided to sculpt that. It was at this time that my name suffered amendment by some of the most ignoble adjectives imaginable, all at the hands of these artistic Philistines. For the love of they'd say, and I could feel the accusation and scorn in the fingers they point at my back in the street in spite of my quiet, unassuming attitude. I can't believe he's going to sculpt an actual pile of feces. Gradually, their disapproval grew more and more obstreperous, culminating in the hurling of stones at the window of the Altier where we all were working. Apparently, Tatekawa owed the hurlers some money, and so Tatekawa started thinking that he might be able to avoid all this trouble if he changed the name of the piece to Bust of a Man, or A Poet, or the more sensationalistic title of One. Although when it came time to exhibit the bust, he wound up carving the title without my approval. Bust of Makino, by Tatekawa Makio. And so Tatekawa shook my hand and, joyous over a job well done, bequeathed the statue to me in commemoration of our days at Pierrevent. In those days I feared nothing more in life than my own shadow, and I spent most of my time composing derogatory songs about myself. I would have much preferred that the piece been titled Bust of a Poet or Face of a Man and promptly sold to one of Tatekawa's patrons. It was for this reason that Monsieur Fujiya forced me to submit to a pact, that were my living situation ever to devolve to the point where I would be unable to find a home for the bust, I was to bring it immediately to him out of deference to Tatekawa's pride. To get to Monsieur Fujiya's Pierrevent Villa, one must follow the Sawtooth Gorge dividing Doryo Forest and Monkey Mountain Forest until it bottoms out, at which one point it begins climbing up about 10 kilometers to where an evergreen forest lies curled up at the feet of Tourette Peak, providing a dense canopy for the ravine hiding an eerily still pond known as the Devil's Tears Pond, on the banks of which one will discover a small assembly of some 50 or so odd cottages, still dreaming the feudal dream, known simply as Whirlwind Village. Located in Upper Ashikaga, Kanagawa Prefecture, the village is some 40 kilometers from Kashiwa Station. Having conveyed my plans to the owner of the watermill, I jettisoned my walking staff and took Xeron's reins, only to stop and wonder whether I might need my walking staff as a goad. This damn thing's as stubborn as a donkey these days, the miller said with a pessimistic grimace. And then, in a dismay of genuine sympathy for the grueling itinerary that awaited me and my heavy cargo, he proceeded to inform me that, had this been a statue of a cow or a chicken, I could have easily sold the thing and enjoyed a future rife of free drinks and the proceeds, and that nobody in their right mind would ever buy a bust of Makino, so I should hurry up and foist it upon Monsieur Fujiya. And on my way home I would see if I couldn't talk Tatekawa out of his latest sculpture, a statue entitled Horse, because he would be happy to take me to the local pawn shop and subsequently go on a hell of a bender with me. And having said this, he attempted to hand me a brand new bamboo switch. Xeron? I threw my arms around the neck of my beloved steed, casting not so much as a glance in the direction of that horrid whip. I refuse to believe that a loyal male like yourself could require a goad, for I would sooner take a goad to my own haunches than strike thee. According to the miller, in the time since I abandoned my village home for city life, depriving Xeron of his chief source of coddles and caresses, what was once a proud hazel steed had turned into an obstinate donkey, a veritable wooden horse that required whipping in order to move at all, and who had even developed a limp, although it would indeed be a boon if Xeron recognized me today and returned to his old self. Oh, he will, I assure you, for Xeron is my trusty steed. Confident in this bond, I grasped Xeron's bridle with a sense of boundless intimacy and joy. Hell, I'm just grateful to have the damn ass out of my sight today, spat the miller as we rode away. I couldn't resist taking my precious pet's ears in my hands. Aye, the very sound of Xeron's hooves sang their joy at my return. The weighty bust danced back and forth against my back, in time with this tune. I was glad that Xeron was here to convey me comfortably to Whirlwind Village. In the past, the miller had always proactively volunteered to carry Tatekawa's sculptures into town, and having auctioned one of these sculptures proceeded to go on a rampage throughout the local bars and brothels, tarnishing Tatekawa's reputation on his way. An unhealthy activity of which he was apparently still quite fond, for when I arrived with the Tatekawa piece on my back, he had all but danced a jig before peeking into my rucksack and, identifying its contents, immediately expressed his unabashed disappointment. Giddily I whispered in Xeron's ear, "Next time your master takes you to town with one of Tatekawa's statues, feel free to stand as still as a Trojan horse. Play up the limp and dump him by the side of the road if you want." Having proceeded the 8 kilometers or so back along the railway embankment, however, Xeron's hooves began tapping a more erratic rhythm, causing me to nearly bite my tongue, loosen my balance, and grab desperately onto Xeron's mane to prevent myself from being pitched off the saddle. At last, noticing a nice green patch of grass by the side of the road, Xeron slowed to a stop and proceeded to commence grazing, forgetting entirely about the rider on his back, in spite of said rider's irascible protests. "Xeron!" I emitted a poignant cry, my dumbfounded head cocked to one side. "Hast thou forgotten me? 'Twas spring a year ago, on the outskirts of the village, where the pussy willows puffed on the banks of the river. I pulled up Xeron's head and pointed off to the distance in the direction of a black-gated villa beside the sacred woods, over which a raptor was flying in spirals. "'Tis I, the jongleur of Piavon," I growled, bringing my face right up to his, "whom you carried to off the great metropolis last year in the spring, when the peach blossoms bloomed in the gardens of those greedy Scrooges." But the moment I let the reins slack, his head would droop back down and begin munching on grass all over again. The villa with the black gate belonged to my in-laws' family, upon which I had mounted many an offensive from the vantage of Xeron's back, and so I assumed that by pointing Xeron's head in this direction, I would immediately evoke the gay dreams of yesteryear. Xeron snorting in fond recognition, but I was wrong. "Xeron," I continued, trying to revive Xeron's mule-stubborn memories, whispering into empty ears, "wert thou not Bucephalus to this bandit poet, as he relived the wine cellars of those greedy Scrooges of barrel after barrel of sake? And should thou still not remember me, yea, I shall sing to you a song of yesteryear. For when I sang this canzonet, I remember thou didst stride at will in pace with the tempo, now quickening, now slacking, as the tune dictated." And so I subdued my melancholy aspect, assuming jaunty airs and cantillating with a tremendous voice, a horse-driving tune in rhythmic hexameters by the name of New Canterbury. Tipple now, recalling King Hiero's feast, and cast towers and forests steep, at the ancient table round, the knights in numbers did abound. But alas, 'twas of no avail. "And was it not thou who at first blush one May morning set off in pursuit of one strikingly beautiful cloud, causing this foolish Archimedes to scream, 'Eureka!' at his followers? Thou wert Pegasus to me, to this student of Stoic learning gathered in a gym of Epictetus school in the name of omniscient love, in the name of a beauty that exceeds human willpower? Yea, in order to find and grasp the flower of truth through the practice of agonizing drunkenness. Wert thou not Recitate to us?" I wrapped my saddle and continued to sing, pumping my fist in the air all the while. And the knights held their swords and their mead aloft, while oaths to the kings were sworn so oft, each knight vowing again that he will return to the crown its missing jewel. But the obstinate donkey did not budge. I leapt from the saddle, and assuming my pose not unlike that of a boatman of Volga, drew all my strength into my arms and gave Xeron's reins a mighty tug. But the strength of a single human was no match for that of a stubborn horse. All that I achieved was the loss of my footing and repeated confrontations between my forehead and the ground. I returned to the saddle, my tears pattering on the dirt below. "And the time I passed out in the village alehouse," I went on in the same vein, weeping with the sort of ardor that one normally reserves for human cohorts. "Without anybody to take your reins and lead you, you took me on your back through the midnight streets and brought me safely home again. Are you not the same kind and self-same Xeron?" Still I sang my plea, in a Homeric rhyme scheme. "Oh, 'twas a hoary and pie-eyed night, Susan street of starry night. A hunter hurries home to his nest, while melancholy lurks in its breast. Onward ho, young ladies of Rugia." But Xeron just stood there, blank-faced, paralyzed, completely static. His dull, heavy eyelids hung over his eyes, unblinking, as per the proverb, "A nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse." He stood there, gazing at a gadfly that buzzed about in front of him until the gadfly attempted to land on his nose, at which point this wooden horse suddenly began shaking violently, kicking at the ground with both back legs and whinnying desperately. I couldn't help but accompany him in this whinnying, clinging like a tree frog to the neck of my cowardly steed, a mere shadow of the Xeron I used to know. With his newfound momentum, Xeron set off down the wildflower-bedecked dike. I thought it advisable to take advantage of the momentum, whilsting a brick ditty as a sort of musical whip, in vagone rotto tempo. Due to Xeron's limp, his gallop only became more wild and barbaric with speed, his mouth falling vacantly open, his teeth bared, twin pillars of steam spouting forth from his flared nostrils and blasting the clear morning sun into microscopic bits. And the thought that I, the conductor of the creaking and decrepit steam engine, must guide it over the steep and dangerous mountain paths that loomed ahead, the thought alone caused the bust on my back to assume a new weight, and my voice to waver from the solemn and rich tones required by the tune at hand, until I grew worried that my lilting timbre might translate into a similar lag in Xeron's pace, and so I swallowed the fear welling up in my throat and bore onward, wailing a Hyksos marching tune at the top of my lungs. Through demon-infested swamp and valley briared, flayed by the hooves of my horse untired, raising a whirlwind that felt like the orgiastic beating of gongs against my breast as we barreled ahead, leaving anything and everything behind us. You must remember that my particular circumstance made any chance encounter with one of the villagers a rather awkward affair, and so I felt further motivated to breeze through this part of my journey as hastily as possible. Had I chosen the path through Tsukada village rather than following along the dike as I was, I could have shaved a great deal of time off my journey. But instead I was obliged to traverse the narrow paths threading through the rice paddies, cutting at a long, arched detour of almost 4 kilometers around the sacred woods. It was at this point that I set my course towards Boar's Nose village. Worried that the villagers in the tiered paddies and fields would hear our blusterous progress and take notice, I kept a vigilant lookout, and whenever the upper body of a paddy-submerged farmer appeared, I would bury my face in Xeron's mane like a grasshopper, discanting my valiant tone to dissipate the fear that all but came popping out of my pores. At some point, jarred by our irregular and violent movement, the bust on my back was bounced aloft, cracking me on the pate and slamming me back down against my spine, as though to knock the wind out of me. But by forcing myself to imagine my destination, Pierrevong, and the feast that awaited me in those castle towers and forest deep, I managed to remain stoic in the face of extreme agony. Having passed through the Tsukada village unharmed, I now had to climb up through the tiered fields of wheat that climbed like steps upon the side of the hill. In truth, 'twas more a small mountain than a hill, before descending on the other side into Boar's Nose village. As I made my way up this zigzagging and uneven path, face buried in Xeron's mane, my appreciation for the convenience of this limping stallion became significantly more acute. Having at least achieved the summit of this hill, I gazed down at Boar's Nose village, spread out below me, and began walk along the ridge of the summit, traversing the rim of a gigantic pestle-shaped valley, intending to circumnavigate the village below entirely. On the other side of the village lay fields and forests and valleys unsettled by humans. Landscapes a traveler would normally find precarious, but which to me would be a source of comfort. Considering the challenges of the road ahead, I knew that I could not afford a moment's hesitation. The sun has already passed its apex, and the purple of the turret peak had assumed a ruddy corona. My journey was not yet halfway complete. I drove Xeron desperately onward, over the rim of that pestle-like mountain range, feeling all the while as though we were crossing a tightrope. Realizing that the path ahead would all but require Xeron's obedient service, I climbed out of the saddle and began walking behind my steed as quietly as possible. Seeing Xeron walk from a rear vantage, I began to be seriously concerned about his limp. I poured some of the liquor I had received from the miller on my canteen into his mouth, inspecting his horseshoes, made a cold compress with some cloth and some liquor and applied it to his bad leg, in anticipation of the challenges to come. For once we had completed our circumnavigation of this pestle valley and began descending into the canyon below, we would enter a region so thickly forested as to be dark by day, a dangerous region where any half-witted brigand could easily escape his pursuer's chevy. This was where a group of robbers who posed as mendicants made their lair, and while I was an acquaintance of their leader, a notorious gunslinger who lit his cigarettes by firing off his gun like a lighter, it happened that I had left for the city without so much as saying farewell, a fact which had so irked him that he had been blustering to everyone that if he ever laid eyes on me again, he would, quote, light me up with his pistol and smoke me like a cigarette. And so I was hell-bent on making my way through this forest without greasing the crosshairs of this most frightening lighter. Xeron's undivided swiftness was therefore imperative. In fact, few were the men who had ever made their way through this forest alone and lived to tell the tale. And it was said that the annals history still waited an adventurer bold enough to follow in the courageous footsteps of Sakata no Kintoki, or Shinra Saburo, and cross this forest at night. To get to Whirlwind Village, one would normally avoid the forest by traversing from village to village. Boar's Nose to Okami, Mitake to Mount Hiryu, Karamatsu on to Monkey Mountain, etc. But since I had already taken a long detour around Okada Village, and due to the grass-eating donkey incident with Xeron, I was now so far behind in my itinerary that I ran the risk of having nightfall on me if I didn't make a beeline through the forest. And even if it would earn me a seat in the halls of glory next to the aforementioned heroes, my confidence in the ability to make the journey at night was somewhere near zero. The very thought of it made my hair stand on end. I had actually traveled through the forest before, but with a large group of friends, and I was pretty sure I would remember the path by daylight. I remembered that after barreling through the depths of the forest, we had passed a cliff with a waterfall, then emerged into an almost blindingly sunny, hilly, and flower-engulfed field. I remember how startled we were after holding our breaths through the murky and oppressive forest, and how we had grasped hands and nodded at each other. And I remember how, after crossing this surreal expanse of meadow, We came across an overgrown scrubland, gnarled with rotting creepers around a rotting old Buddhist temple straight from the pages of fable. There were a number of legends about lone travelers getting caught in grass fires here and dying unnatural deaths. And it was, indeed, the sort of place where a grass fire would certainly be fatal. In these parts, even the bandits of the forest strictly obeyed all laws regarding fire safety during the fall and winter months. Now, having completed this dangerous and bone-chilling course, we would still be granted no repose, for we would then be forced to climb a steep incline of slippery red clay. This hill is held in extreme contempt by the locals, who simply call it Penniless Hill, because it rises at such a sharp and arduous pitch that one is tempted to empty one's pockets of all excess weight when one attempts to climb it, including but not limited to one's purse. What's more, rumor had it that trolls and goblins and the like came out in broad daylight, and many were the tales of hapless travelers waylaid by mischievous creatures here. Now, supernatural episodes like this are likely due to an uncertain level of anemic exhaustion in the traveler, having braved the dangerous mountain passes and finally come to Penniless Hill, and while I myself intended to maintain a certain semblance of lucidity through this part of this trip, my nerves were already feeling rather taut even now. The movement of a sparrow in the brush caused me to flinch violently, and before I knew it I was steeling myself for an encounter with a goblin, just like every other poor fool who ever traveled this route. I had set out in the morning with Xeron's reins in hand, fully intending to rely upon his swift limbs to overcome the many obstacles of the day, and now, as we plodded through the rim of the Pestle Valley, my mind leaping forward to the many difficulties that the coming road would present, I was overcome with an acute sense of danger. As it happened, the clouds that had brought rain the night before had cleared, and the whole world abounded with sparkling freshness and life, the sun coruscating its light over the landscape like a gigantic pair of wings that it spread across the entire sky before letting them fall gently to the ground again and again, in contrast to which that horrible hill lay waiting where sunlight dared not go, crouched all damp and dark and squelchy, its steep face twisted into a muddy and cagey grimace, or perhaps a smirk of anticipation and slipperiness for this poor, poor traveler. Xeron and I had come prepared for the impending battle, with a pair of straw sandals and a walking staff tied to a corner of the saddle in case we had to take the hill step by step. But as I looked down at his bum leg, which limped so severely as to sway me side to side in the saddle, my heart began to fill with what felt like lead. Glancing down beneath my feet, where the distant panorama of Borsnod's village appears as translucent as diamond glass, I began whistling a horse-driving tune, in as light-hearted as a timbre as possible. Smoke from the cottages down in the village hung over the whole scene, indistinguishable from the shimmers and glimmers of sunlight. It was the sort of scene that reminded me of the old poem, poignant though it is, sunset arrives on the last day of spring. I still had quite a while left until sunset. It would be a disaster for the sun to set on me now, and yet I couldn't help but be entranced by the sun-drenched, smoke-streaked calm of the village below, as I sang the old poem aloud in a firm, clear voice. Training my eyes on the village thoroughfare below, I realized that I could make out faces, that I knew exactly who certain people were, where they came from. The guy going over the bridge on a horse cart full of hay, for example, he was the young rancher who brought Tatekawa's statue, Wooden Rabbit. I must not be espied, I whispered, pulling my hat down low over my brow. I had borrowed Wooden Rabbit from this very rancher for simple viewing purposes, only to have the college student staying with me slip off with it and use it as collateral toward another bout of drunken philandering in town. Were this rancher to catch sight of me, he would certainly take the opportunity to collar me and demand reparations. The villagers appeared to be in the midst of digging a new well for the local landlord with the ginkgo grove, because most of them were bustling about his garden, squinting in the sun. If this group were to apprehend my presence, a dogged pursuit would most certainly follow, for it was I who had been so orchestral in helping that bandit gunslinger of the forest to stealing Tatekawa's chicken sculpture from the landlord, who had purchased it lawfully from Tatekawa. I can only speculate where chicken ultimately ended up, but this landlord and his whole entourage had apparently been searching far and wide for me in order to track down the statue. I shifted my gaze to the left now, where the village alehouse stood in the distance, in front of the shrine gate, the owner of the alehouse standing out in the street, shouting and making angry gestures as all who passed by. This alehouse owner was indeed a highly temperamental character, and when Tatekawa and I ran up a small tab at his establishment, he had carried an invoice over hill and gorge, all the way to Tatekawa's atelier, arriving just in time to find us in the process of gazing at the newly completed bust of Makino, a sight which caused him to shout, "Doth thou mock us all, making this sort of useless offal?" And with that, he had hurled an outraged fist at my bronze-enshrined visage, spraining his finger and earning him some hard time in a sling. To this very day, he would tell anyone who would listen of our transgressions. Hi-ho! A chill shot through my breast. The workers digging the well are pointing at me and saying something. I frantically turned my face away from the village, out toward the mountains. Down below the hill, the forest had begun to look like a swamp. It spread out languidly beneath me, unfathomably deep, and if you listened close enough, you could hear the sound of gunfire coming from its murky depths. There was a quick salvo, then silence, then one last retort. An even colder chill seized my breast, for I could not but wonder if our friend the bandit leader was enjoying a cigarette. The people of the village are likely assumed those salvos to be the offhand gunfire of a hunter, but I knew what it really was. For on sunny days like this, that brigand leader would become fidgety and irascible, and in spite of the weather, anxiously smoking cigarette after cigarette, and when one stubborn cigarillo occasioned to conspire against him and did not successfully light in one shot, his hands would begin to tremble as an uncommon bout of anxiety overcame him. He would deem his unlit cigarro inauspicious, throw it to the ground, mash it into the dirt with great vitriol and vigor. He was a deeply superstitious man, treating every event of the day as a harbinger of things to come. Whenever he lit a cheroot on the first shot, his mood was one of generosity and joy. But once his hands began to shake, he would lose all control. This was paranoid hypochondria in its worst form. He would unleash a whole volley of gunfire, his hands shaking with greater and greater violence in proportion to his rage, until the only thing that could ease his spleen was the blood of man or beast. Now, I had not yet determined that this was, indeed, the case, but the sound of this brigand's lighter in the distance was enough to halt me dead in my tracks. Had I whirled enough time, and I would have abided until he had emptied his barrel and lay there napping, as he always did. But the volleys of gunfire did not die down, and simply dilly-dallying where I was would put me in danger of being apprehended by the villagers, while the sun meanwhile continued to sink, bringing the greatest danger of all ever closer. The bandit leader wasn't so heartless as to literally maim his human and animal victims, but rather he took strange pleasure in aiming at the area in his quarry, watching as they ran about, frantically trying to dodge the bullets that whizzed by them. Were he to get his hands on me, he would certainly break into a satisfied grin before subjecting Xeron and I to the most hellish bullying of bullets imaginable, until the sight of our pitiful leaping and dancing about at my last freedom from him the days ennui, the very thought of myself, perched upon my cowardly steed, that absurd burden hanging from my back as we flew this way and that at the whims of a flaming cigarette lighter. It was enough to send a cascade of cold sweat down my forehead. It would be like writhing in the agonizing flames of perdition to me. I could feel heavy fetters begin to close around my ankles. On the edge of that mountainous peak, with the whole world spread out before me, I had somehow been driven to a corner, and yet I drummed up all the courage I could and began goading Xeron forward with that same languid tune. Poignant though it is, sunset arrives on the last day. And yet, although my mouth moved in accordance with the lyrics, I was startled to find that no sound issued forth from my lips. It was then, at that very moment, that Xeron reverted into a stubborn donkey that stopped dead in his tracks. Emitting a cry of utter despair, I began slapping at Xeron's haunches with all my might. At this, Xeron leapt into the air as though delighted, racing forward 20 meters or so before becoming once more a Trojan horse. He even glanced back over his shoulder as though to mock me. Aha! I shouted. This is what the miller spoke of, bemoaning your transformation into a whip-driven mule. Regarding that I had left the whip behind, I caught up to Xeron and, making my right foot a cudgel, smote him vigorously across the haunches. Xeron leapt forward, but soon stopped in the shade of a pine tree, looking over his back as if to say, That's right, come on, give me everything you've got. It was as though he had stopped moving the moment the smarting had faded from his flesh. And to think that I had been driving this thankless excuse for a steed along with songs, praising his past deeds, I grew livid. You ass! I cried, chasing after him. I was out of breath, but my ire was such that my fists flew at him indiscriminately. Gleefully, Xeron pawed at the ground with his hooves before moving forward a few feet. Cursed mule! I cried. I had lost all feeling in my arms. They merely dangled from my shoulders like a pair of lead pencils. Indeed, my furor was such that my legs had given out as well, a fact which did not prevent me from crawling along the ground, desperately trying to overcome Xeron. It was at this moment that I heard the fire bell, a shrill clanging from over in the direction of Borsnow's village. Alack! They have spotted me, and are mobilizing for action! The peals of the fire bell echoed off the surrounding peaks, whirled about in the basin of Pestle Valley, vainly making their appeal to the vast and empty sky. Closing my eyes, I clenched my fist tight around a nearby stone. Biting my lip, I began spinning my lame arm around like a pinwheel, taking careful aim before whipping this stony missile at Xeron with all the momentum and abaddon of David's sling. Take that, Goliath! I cried as my desperate hope found purchase in Xeron's haunches, a perfect dead ball. Xeron kicked his hind legs wildly through the sky and dashed ahead. Recognizing the need to follow with the second volley, I continued to crawl onward at full speed, my heavy baggage pressing me to the ground, until at last I caught up to Xeron, whose gait had already begun to slacken, whereupon I crawled underneath his head and, just as Samson tore the jawbone from an ass in days of yore, I unleashed one exemplary uppercut toward his mandibular. Unfortunately, Xeron had chosen that very moment to turn his head in the direction of the clangorous fire bell, and my fist went shooting futilely through the air. The momentum of the punch sent my body somersaulting into a patch of thistles, but I leapt to my feet, and, never stopping to catch my breath, said Shamgar's legendary ox goad slamming into Xeron's belly. Baring his teeth, Xeron whinnied wildly and began leaping forward in the undulating sign of waves of an Olympic hurdler. I grasped the reins that dragged behind him, and, having chased him for several yards, finally managed to leap into the saddle. It was with the erratic, arithmetic violence of a war drum that I beat his sides, clinging to his mane like a cavalry on the attack and screaming for him to giddy up, giddy up, giddy up! For a while, Xeron seemed to be as fervent as I, leaping over higher and higher imaginary hurdles and lunging forward along the rim of Pestle Valley, until at last we came to the top of the hill that led down into the forest. Looking back over my shoulder, I discovered that the fire bell was, in fact, a genuine fire alarm. Flames were visible near the landowner's storehouse, and the firemen were pulling a pump along behind their flag, while people came running from all directions. Someone was blowing a trumpet. Villagers were crying out. Unfortunately, it looked like the old well was no longer accessible, perhaps due to the new well that they were digging, because one group of firemen was frantically trying to drag a hose down to the creek. The hose wasn't reaching, though, and their leader had climbed onto the fire tower and was waving his hat around, shouting to the other firemen, "Hose! Hose, hose!" I could hear his voice in the distance. The flames were now moving, but from the storehouse to the landlord's residence. For a while the sky seemed clear, but soon thick gray smoke began billowing out from under the eaves of the landlord's house. "Hose! Horse! Xeron!" I thought I heard the man up in the fire tower scream. The hose had made its way into the creek, and people hung from it as though playing tug-of-war. A thin jet of water soon appeared from the other end of the hose, spurting up into the eaves of the landlord's house. The rhythmic shouts of men working the pump echoed across the valley. Are they asking me for help? "Ahoy! You! Riding Xeron! Come here! I need to talk to you!" This is what I heard. Hunkered down in Xeron's mane, I opened my eyes a crack and peered in the direction of the voice. Upon closer inspection, I realized that the man on the fire tower was none other than the cigarillo-smoking leader of the brigadans. He was cleverly disguised as one of the firemen. He was knelling the fire bell instead of the watchman, and everyone was so engrossed in the fire that they didn't realize that his erratic rhythm was actually a secret signal to his henchmen. Between rings, he was waving me over to him. From what I could read of his Morse code tolling, he was communicating something along the lines of, "Welcome back, my friend. I've been terribly lonely these days. Why don't you take this opportunity to join my gang again? I'll even share some of today's spoils with you. P.S. I stole your suit of armor back." He was referring, of course, to a suit of armor belonging to my ancestors, which fell into the possession of the landlord due to debts outstanding. When my grandmother found out that I had drunk so much liquor that I had forfeited the family suit of armor, she requested that I commit ritual suicide to preserve the family honor. She also stated, in a subsequent letter, that she would revoke her lifelong disownment if I ever won this precious treasure back. The bell continued to bong. "Why must you always starve yourself over poetry?" For a moment I was tantalized by a vision of the prodigal son, returning to his parents' home, bedecked in red-threaded hyodoshi armor. But then I remembered that intent and unrelenting stare that never really focused on anything, lips pouted out like a Black-Uno mask in a pathetic attempt to look as young as possible, the expression of my father in a portrait that hung in the dim and dismal study I would have to return to, where I would be forced to participate in the accursed passions of Zen meditation. This all came back to me at once, and it depressed me. I have never felt as hopeless and nihilistic as when I was with my father. I intended to destroy that portrait at the first opportunity, and certainly would do so, although such an opportunity had yet to present itself. I was never capable of creating poetry unless faced with starvation, in the middle of some bright and endless wasteland. "Listen," said the fire bell. "I can tell you how to sell that gigantic burden you carry." "This bust?" I queried back in Corinthian gymnastic sign language, desperate to know the answer. "Sell it to your family as a bust of our Makino. You look similar enough that no one will doubt its authenticity." Our Makino was the man in the portrait. He had died some 10 years back. I had been on the lam for 10 years now. I see! It was brilliant, I realized, but at the same time, I was overcome with a horrifying sense of fatalism, grasping onto Xeron's ears and squeezing them with all my might. And then I fell out of the saddle. "Giddy up!" Continuing to assail Xeron's hunches with a barrage of knuckles, we began heading down the hill. The tuft of the ass's tail flew into my face like the spray of a water wheel. Between these splashes of horsetail, I could see Tourette Peak beginning to turn madder red amidst the cool purple of the distant frontier mountain range. All around the feet of those mountains the forest spread out, darkening already in the vesper light, quick, quiet and still, fathomless and brimming with nightmares, while a bizarre and bum-legged donkey went hurtling down toward it, leaping like a grasshopper with each successive swat, its cruel driver barreling after. The bust on my back came to life, and the man of the portrait came bursting through the sky, soaring over this green swamp, gliding over mountains, fluttering about and taking me by the arms as Xeron stood up on his hind legs, and we all took to the sky, eating our way through the clouds and dancing a joyfully and herky-jerky rococo quadrille. What a gorgeous sight, I thought, agog at the spectacle. I could still hear the fire bell tolling in the distance, but no longer understood its import. The clanging simply became the undying rhythm for our quandrille. Could this be? Then suddenly I came back to my senses. I took the rucksack in my arms like a baby and whispered to it, "I guess the only choice I have is to toss you into Devil's Tears Pond." Smiting Xeron's hunches with unflagging blows, we hurled down into that swamp-like valley. The treetop branches were algae on the swamp floor. Looking up toward the surface of the water, the birds returning to roost became schools of fish. Even Xeron and I were suddenly gilled. My heavy burden tore into the flesh of my back, and how the swamp water smarted on those wounds. Or was it blood, I wondered? Note: Tatekawa Makio's bust of Makino is currently in possession of Furuya Satoru of Tsukuhara village in the upper Ashikaga in the realm of Soshu. Although one of Tatekawa's most representative works, the artist himself insisted that, quote, "Once it's all bronzed, I have no problem keeping the thing at the bottom of the swamp." And it was only at the behest of good friends that he agreed to preserve it with Furuya, where anyone can arrange for public view showing, should they so desire. The 1929 Nippon Art Institute's official category provides a photograph. Apparently, Tatekawa is currently working on a statue of Xeron entitled, "Xeron, I continue to eke out an existence that is as free and uninhibited as it is beggarly and vagrant." The end. I don't believe there's a study guide up yet, but Professor Morrison will make one soon, so that's all for today. Bye-bye! What a mouse smell like a girl. I attest it would be really funny if I did it from this angle, but I'm not in charge. So, it's just me today. Oh my god!
It's a good blooper. Coffee?
Coffee?
Can I put it in here?
Probably.
I did.
For some time now, Monsieur Fui... Oh my god. Fui. It's not French. It's half French. Made an immediately beeline north. Okay, wait, that's... Something's up here. And turned your eyes up to the northern western sky. Northern western? Even with its short... Okay. Due to the What was that? A scholar of classical Greek and medieval European chivalrous literature? As he relieved the wine cellars of those greedy Scrooges, becomes Groody. The gym of Epestis of y'all, I don't know. This guy's a total puss. My god, he does the dance. Dance, boy. Dance. Alright, so I wanted tea, but they're out of cups in the little, I guess, the break room. So I don't get tea, I just get to suffer. Alright, off to a great start.